Hello, everybody! Happy holidays, Merry Christmas. It's really wonderful to be back. Today is Christmas Eve here in Norwich in the United Kingdom. It's incredibly stormy outside. You might be able to see that in the reflection. The trees are billowing, the rain is thrashing down. It's much more suited to a Halloween story today than a Christmas story. I confess I haven't finished reading my Halloween story yet, and I will come back to it, I promise. But today I wanted to just spend an hour or so with you all, just to celebrate Christmas, celebrate the holidays, and celebrate the Escape from Furnace Christmas special. This is a story I wrote last year. I posted on Wattpad last year. Some of you will have read it. It's a story about Donovan before Alex arrives in Furnace Penitentiary, and something that happens inside Furnace. Probably, I think one of the sweetest moments in the Escape from Furnace universe. I was crying I can't even think of a good comparison, like Santa when he runs out of mince pies. That's how badly I was crying when I wrote this story. It's a sweet little piece. Probably take about an hour. I don't know, I've not read it through yet. I'm reading it on my daughter's iPad, which has got a really cool monster that she drew. It looks like it could be something out of a Escape from Furnace. Well done, Avalon, great drawing. So I'm going to read it. Just you might want to just pause, make yourself a cup of tea, grab a mince pie or a bit of Yule log, and listen in. And I hope you're all well. I hope you're all okay. What a year this year has been. I'm not going to say too much about it. Everyone has been in the same position this year. And I hope you've managed to get through the year without losing people, without losing jobs, without losing hope. But if you have lost any of those things, then you're not the only ones and you're not alone. And I think hopefully the thing that's come out of this year is that we are all here for each other, and we know that we're all here, and we give each other strength, we give each other hope, and we know that. I'm constantly amazed by human beings and the good that we can do. And I think that's hopefully what's come out of this, is that we know that we're there for each other. We're a community, we can support each other. And hopefully you found support and help where you need it. And hopefully you found hope as well. Because as I've said many times, hope, I think, is the most important thing in the world. And there is hope. 2021 is going to be a better year. So wherever you are, whatever's happened to you this year, I send my love. I love you all. And I hope you're well. And I hope that you can just take a moment and join me in this story, which is called Silent Night. It's gonna work, kiddo. It has to work. The three boys huddled in the cell, shivering despite the suffocating heat. Adam sniffed, wiping a hand across his face. His eyes scrolled back and forth like he was reading some invisible text, but Donovan... It's nice to see you, Donovan. But Donovan knew he was thinking, always thinking. Cool your jets, Adam, warned Batik, glancing through the open door of the cell. Got to be careful what you say here. Wall's got ears. Ears and eyes, said Adam, nodding as he turned to Donovan. And teeth, too. Eating us all alive. You in or out, kiddo? Your plan, but if you're serious about it, then you've got to let me know one way or the other. In or out? Donovan took a breath of stale air, barely finding a scrap of oxygen in it. After nearly 5 years, he should have been used to the heat down here, but there were some things that never felt right. This place was cruel like that. Just when you thought you had a grip of things, it changed. Some days were hot, some days were cold. Some days seemed to pass in a flash, others seemed to drag on forever. And with no way of looking outside, maybe they did. Maybe the warden just made up the rules as he went, simply to torture them. He was a monster, after all. This place was a monster. In, said Donovan, the word out of his mouth before he'd even given it permission. I'm in. Adam slapped him on the shoulder, hard enough to release a pistol shot of sound that echoed out into the yard. Good man, he said. This place ain't got us beat yet. Not yet, Donovan thought, but it was close. He could feel it taking a little more of him every day. His memories, his dreams, his hopes, and he wasn't sure how much he had left before he vanished entirely. Just an empty set of bleached prison overalls that trod ghost-like from his cell to the canteen, to the chipping rooms, to the showers, over and over and over. The panic was a depth charge that exploded in his chest, filling him with cold darkness. He stood, planting a hand on the rock wall to keep his balance. Breathe. Just breathe. Breathe, said Adam, like he was reading his mind. He stood up too, planting a big hand on Donovan's shoulder. Plenty of air here, even if it stinks of Batik's B.O. Hey, Batik said. He sniffed his armpit, pulling a face. Actually, yeah, fair point. Donovan managed to laugh, and with it came a rush of oxygen. Adam squeezed his shoulder, holding him until Donovan nodded his gratitude. I'll draw up a list, Adam said. Work out what we need, but be ready, it could happen any time. Somebody out in the yard screamed, the noise followed by a shout of anger. A rush of cries swelled like a wave, and Batek ran through the cell door onto the metal platform that overlooked the prison. He swore, glancing back. Skirmish, he said. Goddamn skulls, gonna run before they lock it down. He vanished before anyone could reply, and Donovan could hear the thunder of feet on metal as anyone with a shred of sense made a break for the stairwells. Seconds later there was a sharp report from a shotgun and another scream. That was the other thing he could never get used to, that symphony of terror. Place ain't got us beat yet, Adam said again, climbing onto his bunk. Stay away from the door, Carl. No point getting popped this close to Christmas. Sure, Christmas, Donovan said, but he took a step away anyway. Like you checked your diary this morning, called your PA, middle of summer for all you know. Adam waved his words away with a pfft, lying back on the creaking bed with his hands behind his head. Donovan clambered into the bottom bunk and closed his eyes. He had no idea what time of year it was either, but Adam's words had caused a perfect alignment of synapses. He caught the sudden scent of pine needles. He heard the carol singers. He felt the satisfying rip of the wrapping paper as he tore into his presence. For a moment, for less than a moment, he was a kid again, sitting on his mum's bony knee, feeling her laughter beating against his back like a drum as she held him tight. Then he felt another sound, a vibration that travelled up through the stone, through the bed, through his body, as if the prison had opened its mouth and loosed a silent, awful scream. The noise followed almost instantly, the lockdown siren like a javelin thudding into the flesh of his brain. He clamped his hands to his ears against it, against the rattle of 1,000 doors as they slid along their rails, against the earth-shattering boom of them closing. More shouts. Place ain't got us beat yet, Adam had said. The blood-soaked howl of the warden's dogs. Place ain't got us beat yet. But it was close. It was so close. One last scream, torn off at the end, then the dull laughter of the black suits. Adam was right. Furnace Penitentiary was eating them all alive, and this plan was the only thing that could save them. It was the only thing that could set them free. There aren't chapters in this, by the way. It's just one long story. If anyone is interested, you can find it on Wattpad. It's Wattpad. On Alexander Gordon Smith on Wattpad. You can read along if you like. You know what you got to do? Adam and Donovan stood on the metal platform of the 6th level, watching as the inmates rolled from their cells. Every last one was red-eyed and exhausted, stooped over like puppets with slack strings, but there wasn't a soul amongst them who didn't seem relieved to be free from those stone coffins. The last echoes of the morning siren were fading, and black suits lined the yard below like funeral directors, their shotguns sweeping back and forth. A couple of inmates had sluiced the rock floor clean last night, but Donovan could still see the red stain that had once been a prisoner. The dogs had taken him apart, piece by piece, until one of the guards had put him out of his misery. He'd got off lightly, Donovan thought. He could have ended up in the infirmary instead. Hey, Carl, Adam said, nudging him. You know what you got to do? Donovan nodded, still staring at the yard. Say it then, said Adam. I got this, Donovan said, looking at his friend. Adam looked as tired as the rest of them, but he had an inner strength that always made him stand tall. He wasn't big, no taller than Donovan, even though he was a year older, but he was fierce, and he'd been no stranger to violence outside of prison. He'd come up to Furnace from juvie the same time as Donovan, when they'd opened the goddamn place. But he'd been incarcerated half his life by then. He had the look. That OG gunpowder stare, the swagger, the broken nose. He'd have scared Donovan like he'd scared the others if Donovan didn't know him so well. "You got this, do you?" Adam said, smiling. "Always the big man, eh?" "Bigger than you," Donovan said, grinning back. Adam feigned a punch, and Donovan blocked it, laughing. "Seriously, though," Donovan said, "I got this." They set off, walking along the balcony and clattering down the stairs. Other prisoners moved out of Adam's way, standing aside to let them through. It was Adam they were wary of, but they had a certain respect for Donovan too, the way they respected all the originals. Moving to Furnace hadn't exactly been on Donovan's wish list, but there were advantages to being one of the first inmates through the Black Fort. Even the Skulls and the 49ers tended to leave them alone. The giant screen above the yard fizzed into life as Donovan bounced off the bottom step into the melee. He scanned the list, looking for his name, feeling his aching muscles groan at the knowledge they'd be chipping all day again. "Oh, come on now, that ain't right," said Adam. And Donovan scanned the list again, bursting into laughter. "You got the stink," he said. "Wouldn't want to be you right now." "Oh, shut your mouth," Adam said, "or I'm going to use you as a toilet brush." One of the black suits fired a shot from his gun, pellets tinkling off the railings overhead and the sharp firework tang of gunpowder filling Donovan's nostrils. "You got your jobs," he said in that booming voice they all seemed to share. "Go grab some slop, then get to work." Adam and Donovan did as they were told, passing through the tunnel of rock that led into the trough room. Almost immediately, Donovan felt Adam shunt him to the side. He looked up to see a swarm of skulls in the middle of the canteen. They were beating the living hell out of somebody, their arms and legs moving like pistons. Donovan spotted Ambrose Pope standing a head taller than everyone else, a black bandana wrapped tight around his shaven head and almost a full beard on his chin. He loosed a powerful kick at whoever lay at his feet, his grin so wide it might have been a knife wound slashed from ear to ear. Kevin was there too. Just a kid, but already one of the biggest psychos in Furnace. If you didn't count the staff, that was. If you listened to the prison rumour mill, he'd been blooded 3 times already, and out of the 3 prisoners he'd sent to the infirmary, not one had come back. He held a tray in blood-slicked hands, laughing gleefully as he brought it down like a guillotine blade. Donovan looked away, swallowing down the anger and the fear. Not one single part of him wanted to interfere with what was going on over there. Better to just switch off, pretend it wasn't even happening. "Here," said Batek, as he met them by a table. He dropped 3 bowls of watery oatmeal, then sat down, shaking his head sadly. "No burgers?" said Donovan, the way he said every day. But there was no humour there. The wet slaps and feeble cries had sucked all of the air out of the room. "One of the new fish," said Batek. "No way he's coming back from that." "What did he do?" Adam asked, as he took his seat. "He looked at Kevin," said Batek. "That's it, just looked at him." With a round of cheers, the skulls broke free, scattering. Behind them, a prisoner lay twitching and groaning on the floor, one trembling hand reaching to the sky like it might find help there. There wasn't any, of course. Nobody else was even watching him, as if he existed in another realm of reality altogether. Donovan pushed his bowl away, his stomach boiling. Even if he'd wanted to help, there was nothing he could do. 2 black suits were strolling into the canteen, and in a matter of seconds they dragged the kid away. "Poor bastard," said Batek. "Belongs to Cross now." "We should go," Adam said, wolfing down his slop and nodding across the room. Ambrose and Kevin were strolling back into the canteen like they didn't have a care in the world, all swagger and smiles. Ambrose eyeballed Adam as he passed, offering him the slightest of nods. Adam gave one back, and even though Donovan kinda hated him for it, he felt a rush of relief. Could have been Adam being dragged through the vault door right now. Could have been any of them. They were back out in the yard before Donovan found his voice. "That's 2 down in as many days," he said. "Getting worse. You sure this is worth it?" "Quiet," growled Adam, firing a warning look at Donovan. "You want the whole prison to find out what we're doing?" I'm serious, Donovan went on in a whisper. We mess this up. We're dead. We're worse than dead. You tell me it's worth it. You tell me it will work. Adam stopped, wheeling around until he was face to face with Donovan. His face wore a look of anger that Donovan rarely saw. This is worse than death, he said. We're corpses down here, rotting day by day. We need to try, Carl. We need to do something. He pushed his knuckles into his bloodshot eyes, sighing. Then he blinked at Donovan. He was 16, but he looked 50. Needs to be 3 foot long, he said. No shorter. Don't mess this up, kiddo. I won't, said Donovan. Trust me. Crack! Donovan's whole body rang with the force of the strike, his bones singing like tuning forks. He grimaced against the shower of shrapnel that rebounded from his visor, lifting the pickaxe and bringing it down again. The tip bit into the wall, but steel was no match for the ancient rock, and it barely scratched the surface. It didn't matter, though. Hard labour wasn't really about chiselling out the new rooms for the prison. It was about keeping the prisoners busy. And he was fine with that. The work didn't just numb your body. It was supposed to numb your mind, too. Only, it didn't numb Donovan's mind. It had the opposite effect. It made his thoughts unbearably sensitive. Every time he swung the pick, that moment came back to him. Thunk. Every time the blade connected with the wall, that memory came back to him. Thunk. Every time he felt that tremor pass down his arms and into his spine, it all came back to him. Thunk. That awful, life-ending moment. It hadn't been a pick, it had been a candlestick. And who the hell had one of those anymore? His mum had picked it up at a yard sale just a few weeks before it had happened. She'd liked it because it had been an Art Deco piece in bronze or brass or something. A half-naked lady just like the one on the front of a Rolls Royce, arced over, arms back. Donovan had always imagined she loved it because the woman looked like she was flying, her clothes billowing behind her, a smile on her face as she soared through the clouds. He'd always thought she liked it because she thought that one day she too would fly. We could glue it to the front of the car, she'd said, laughing. Well, if we had a car. She hadn't even had any candles, so she'd propped her cigarettes in it for a joke. He swung the pickaxe again, his muscles burning with the effort. Thunk. It hadn't been a pick, it had been a candlestick, but it had been just as deadly. Thunk. But what was he supposed to have done? That creep Ryan had been beating on his mum again, steamed on liquor, his eyes as big as those of a panicked horse. He'd been beating on her for years, getting worse and worse, and with every lost job, with every missed rent bill. But that night he'd been beating on her bad. He's going to kill her. Those words had exploded in Donovan's brain with every punch. He's going to kill her. He's going to kill her. He's going to kill her. So he picked up that half-naked metal lady and he'd swung hard. Thunk. And something in Ryan's head had shattered like glass. Thunk. And that had been that. I'm sorry, Mum, he said, swinging the pick again and trying, just for once, to think of her face instead of Ryan's. But the worst of it was, he couldn't really remember what she looked like anymore. Less than a year after an 11-year-old Donovan had killed Ryan, and just 2 short months after her only child had been given life without parole in Furnace Penitentiary, his mum had flown. She'd flown for good. Focus, Carl, he told himself, heaving in a shuddering, airless breath. It didn't do to think too hard about it. That's what Furnace did. It sucked out everything good and amplified the bad. Besides, he had a job to do. A job. An easy one on the surface. He needed a pick, but just the wooden shaft, not the blade. It would be too hard to try to smuggle out the whole thing, too dangerous as well, because that would be classed as a weapon and punished with time in solitary. A 3-foot wooden pole was a different matter. It would be difficult, but not impossible. He took a break, lifting the helmet from his head and mopping his dripping brow with his sleeve. All around him, prisoners attacked their own portion of wall, the sound of it like some vast, infernal machine. Kids with wheelbarrows and shovels did their best to clear the mess without getting pickaxes rammed through their skulls. They were in the second of 3 rooms that were being chipped, and this one was bigger than the rest. Wooden props strained against the low ceiling, but Donovan couldn't help but think of the billions of tons of rock that pushed back. One seismic hiccup would splinter those toothpicks, and the roof would clap down like a hand on a mosquito. They wouldn't even see it coming. Still, at least it would be quick. He shuddered, taking a moment to rest on the pickaxe. He saw that a single rusting screw connecting the metal head to the shaft. Casting a look over his shoulder to make sure there were no black suits around, he bent down and picked up a sliver of rock from the ground. It was as sharp as a razor, and when he slotted the edge into the head of the screw, it fit like a dream. "Hold fire," he ordered himself. It wasn't as simple as unscrewing the pick. If the black suits caught him, then they'd shoot first and ask questions never, and even if they didn't, he had to bring the tool back at the end of his shift. He needed a distraction. He took another half-hearted shot at the wall, then glanced to the far end of the cavern. Drowning in the shadows were 6 or 7 leopards. He'd always thought it was the stupidest name for a gang, and the reason for it was even more ridiculous. During the summer of slaughter, those guys had run loose with all the others, looting and murdering and tearing up the country. Every time they'd taken a life, they burned a cigarette into the skin of their faces to create ugly, red welts. Their leader, a kid called Santiago, whose face looked like a pepperoni pizza, wasn't there today, but Donovan recognised his lieutenant, Figgy. He'd had a few skirmishes with them already, mainly when he was younger. One of those, a brutal fight between him and Figgy, had led to a short stay in the hole, a short stay that had almost killed him. He'd always said he'd die before he went back, but that was before he knew he had something to fight for. Something thumped into his skull, and for an awful second he thought it was an explosion because the room was full of sparks. Then they fizzled into a sickening darkness, and he spun around to see a black suit right behind him. He'd smacked Donovan in the back of the head with his shotgun, and he looked ready to smack the front as well. I'm working, Donovan said, sliding his visor back down. The black suit grunted, his weird silver eyes flashing. Then he lumbered away through the cavern. Donovan swore silently to his back, wondering whether it would be worth the pain that followed if he was just to drive his pickaxe into the back of the man's head. He took out his anger on the wall instead, hammering out chunks of rock until the black suit had vanished through the tunnel that led back to the equipment room. He'd be back in minutes, so Donovan moved fast. He still didn't have a plan, but it didn't exactly take much to ignite the powder keg that was Furnace. Pushing past the other inmates, his pickaxe still gripped in his hand, he approached the nearest leopard, making sure to lock eyes with him. He was just a kid, a new recruit, no cigarettes to burn him down here, but a circular knife wounds marked into his cheeks. "What's your problem?" he said, his voice barely audible over the ring of metal on rock. The other boys had stopped what they were doing, holding their pickaxes like weapons. "Got no beef with you," he said, thinking as he went. He cast a look to the side, saw a couple of inmates with black stripes painted beneath their eyes, football style, jamming a prop beneath the ceiling. 59ers. It was a crappy thing to do, he knew, but what choice did he have? If he stood here for much longer without saying anything, then he'd end up with a pickaxe blade in him. "But, I thought you guys should know. I heard those Niners mouthing about you." The kid frowned, looking past Donovan. What did they say?" he asked. "Go ask them," Donovan said. He left it there, turning his back on the leopards and strolling as calmly as he could across the cavern. Even before he'd made it back to his station, he heard the shouts, and by the time he'd lifted his pickaxe to attack the wall again, punches and kicks were flying between the two gangs. He shook his head. It took a special kind of stupid to start fighting in the chipping rooms. It was a guaranteed ticket to the hole. Then again, it took a special kind of stupid to do what he was about to do. Donovan jammed the rock shard into the screw head, twisting hard, until the old screw released. He spun it as best he could, watching as the leopards went to work on the 59ers. To their credit, the two Niners were fighting back hard. One leopard was out cold already, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. "Enough!" came a roar. A black suit barreled into the chamber, shotgun locked and loaded. Inmates scattered as he crossed the room in a heartbeat and took out one leopard with a crunching blow to the head. Another guard followed, moving so quickly he was just a blur in the darkness. He grabbed the remaining 59er, lifting him up single-handed by the scruff of his neck. The kid kicked out, his foot connecting with the nearest prop and sending it flying. A noise filled the room. It wasn't a sound Donovan had ever heard before. It was immense, the vibration of it travelling through him at a pitch that made his bones ache. It was as if the entire world had shouted out a warning, and with a terrible lurch of his heart he understood that's exactly what had happened. The ceiling had split, a giant, jagged crack opening up above the fighting gangs and dousing them in dust. "Cave in!" he heard one of the black suits roar, and chaos erupted before the echo of his words had faded. Somebody thumped into Donovan as they charged from the room, sending his helmet flying from his head. Another kid tore past, and Donovan ran with him, clinging onto the pickaxe. Another world-ending peal of thunder boomed overhead, a pulse of screams rising up from the scattering inmates. They were plunging into the narrow tunnel, a bottleneck of squirming forms who clawed madly at each other. Donovan threw himself into the back of them, the pick still in his hands. His first instinct was to drop it, but he kept his composure, one hand gripping the wood, the other working at the metal blade. It was coming loose, but reluctantly, and as inmates slammed into his back, he found that there was no room to manoeuvre it. Screams and shouts poured into his skull, the scrum of people so thick he couldn't breathe. Even past the sound of them, though, he heard the ceiling spit out another thunderclap, and this time a concussive blast of wind pushed past him as something punched the air out of the room. He drove forwards, pushing, no oxygen left in his chest, pushing until suddenly the tunnel ejected him. He fell onto a squirming pile of bodies, sucking down air as he scrambled for freedom. Black suits were pouring into the equipment room, but the panic was too real, and they were powerless against the flow of inmates. Donovan moved with the current, finally able to twist the head of the pickaxe free and hurl it to the floor. He clamped the shaft to his chest and rode the tide all the way out into the yard. Donovan. I need to just switch on the plug or the laptop will die. Oh, where is it? Oh, cables, eh? Cool. Okay. Oh, that was a close one. Cave-in room 2, eh? Any of these things sounding familiar? Please tell me that wasn't you. Donovan looked up, seeing a blurred shape walk down the platform. He blinked hard, his eyes still full of dust, until he saw that it was Adam. He couldn't help but feel relieved. It was the way he always felt when he saw him, like he wasn't just a kid, but his guardian angel. Adam sat down next to him, sliding his legs through the railing and staring at the yard 6 floors beneath them. There weren't many inmates down there, and it wasn't hard to see why. Dozens of black suits hovered by the entrance to the chipping rooms, and there were 3 dogs there too, their horrific, skinless bodies glistening in the harsh prison light. "Carl," said Adam. He ran a finger over Donovan's cheek, and when he pulled it away, there was blood. "Seriously, what happened? You okay?" "Cave in," Donovan said. He put a hand to his face, feeling the sting. He couldn't even remember getting hurt. But not a full one. I wouldn't be here if the whole place had come down. I think the ceiling split. Adam swore under his breath. "Anyone die?" he asked. Donovan shook his head, immensely grateful for this fact. "Some broken bones," he said, "but everyone came out on their own 2 feet. "You realise you didn't answer my first question?" Adam asked, and Donovan could feel his friend looking at him. "It wasn't me," he said. He laughed, and he couldn't quite work out why, other than the fact that he was still breathing, still talking. "You know, it wasn't all me, that was. I only started it, got the 59ers to thank for the broken prop." "You're insane," Adam said, his smile a blast of sunshine. "I hope it don't come back to bite you in the ass. 1 prop, Jesus, that's all it took to bring the whole ceiling down." Donovan nodded, and Adam clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Glad you made it out, Carl," he said. "This place is bad enough without you in it." Adam pulled his hand away, but if anything it felt like the weight on Donovan's shoulders had grown 100-fold. Don't worry about it. There will be other chances, Adam said. Oh, I'm not worried. I did it. You what? Adam said. Where? Donovan used the railing to haul himself up, checking left and right down the platform before walking him to the cell. He reached into his bed and slid out the pickaxe shaft, resting it on his shoulder and grinning at Adam. Told you I got this, he said. You got this, said Adam, nodding in approval. He held out his hand and Donovan passed him the shaft. Adam swung it from side to side, nodding, then gave it back. Perfect. I got what I needed too. He patted his uniform and Donovan heard the scrape of metal against metal. You find some interesting things when you're on stink duty, he said. Grabbed myself 7 shanks from beds and toilets, all sharp as hell. He winced. Matter of fact, I need to find somewhere to put them before I end up diced. He walked to the bed, gingerly pulling 5 homemade metal blades from his overalls and sliding them beneath his mattress. They would be safe there. The warden and his guards always spoke of cell sweeps and body searches, but the honest truth was they didn't care if the prisoners killed each other. One more murdered inmate was one less mouth to feed. Besides, as far as the world knew, or as far as the world was concerned, the boys of Furnace Penitentiary were already dead. It was the first thing they were told when they walked through the doors of the Black Fort. Halfway there, said Adam, patting his mattress. Let's hope Batek hasn't screwed up and that one of us is in the kitchen tomorrow. We're really going to do this, Donovan said. And with the words came a sudden and unexpected surge of excitement. The plan had been his, just a stupid throwaway suggestion. Up to this morning he hadn't believed it would ever happen. But now there was a chance, a microscopic chance, but still a chance, that it would work. Too late to turn back now, said Adam. It's really not too late, Donovan replied with a laugh. I mean, we could literally chuck all this stuff today and forget the whole thing. You nearly brought down an entire chipping room for this, Adam said, walking past Donovan and heading out of the cell. Come on, let's go grab some trough before the whole damn prison collapses. Donovan stirred the mess with his plastic spoon, trying not to look too hard at what might be in it. Pale pink lumps and weird bulbous white things that might have been maggots drowned in the soupy paste, and the whole thing stank of vomit. Still, it was food, and he was starving. Anyone else getting that? Said Batik, grimacing. That aroma of fresh puke? Come on, man, said Adam, grimacing. I got to eat the stuff. I don't want to think about it. I bet one of the cooks emptied their guts into it, Batik went on. Bet they wanted to give it a little extra texture. Bat, enough, Adam said, genuinely irritated. Probably shat in it too, Donovan added with a smile. Adam threw his spoon down. Every goddamn day, he said. I'm going to start sitting with the new fish. Sure, said Donovan. Say goodbye to your street cred in one move. Sitting next to you shot my street cred to shreds a long time ago, Adam said. Jerk. They were speaking quietly because the mood in the canteen was bleak. Inmates sat at their tables talking in low whispers, or not at all. A black suit had been stationed by the entrance, which was unusual. As much as he hated them, Donovan was grateful to see him there. Nobody would start a skirmish with an armed guard in the room. Everybody knew how itchy a black suit's trigger finger was. He was worried too, because on the other side of the room, the little table of leopards kept glancing over at him, murder writ large on their fire-pocked faces. Word must have got out that he started the fight in the chipping hall, and sooner or later he was going to have to explain himself to them. It had been a stupid move. He should have just smacked one of them and dealt with the consequences, or knocked out a prop himself. Instead, he'd snitched on another gang, and everyone in Furnace knew that snitches got stitches. Yo, Carl, you okay? Donovan nodded. Yeah, just keep thinking, he said, taking a spoonful of slop and holding his breath until it had gone down. You know, about Christmas and everything. He lied. You really think we're in the holidays? Got a feeling about it, Adam said. His bells are jingling, Batik added, laughing. Adam smacked him on the arm. You don't feel it? Adam asked, even quieter than before. Something in the air? You're losing it, Donovan said. But he didn't mind. God only knew the conversations down here were depressing. It didn't hurt to focus on the good for once. You guys have good Christmases on the surface? Adam shook his head, staring at his food like there were memories playing there. We were lucky if Dad remembered, he said. But when he did remember, it was okay. He even got us good stuff. He got me a PlayStation once. He laughed. Fool forgot to buy any games for it though, and we didn't have the internet, so I just sat there the whole day and stared at it. You know, that was one of the first times I got in trouble, trying to lift a copy of GTA from Walmart on Boxing Day. Damn security guard was far fatter than all hell, and he still caught me. He sighed, shaking his head and looking at Batek. You? Batek frowned. You guys know I'm a Muslim, right? Oh, yeah, sorry, said Adam, and Batek waved him away with a laugh. Nah, we still had Christmas, he went on. You can't exactly avoid it, and you don't miss the chance to stuff your face with chocolate all day, right? It's hard not to get excited. We had Eid and everything, but we still had Christmas in a way. Presents and crap, you know. He shrugged. Dee? Yeah, said Donovan. Mum loved Christmas. She kicked off the holidays right after Halloween, like literally the next day. Tree went up after Thanksgiving dinner. Tinsel and baubles and all that stuff. She had this tape. A tape, not even a CD. Can you believe that? Full of Christmas songs that she'd made when she was a kid. She never turned it off. The rush of the arriving past was almost overwhelming. It felt like standing right on the edge of the subway platform when the train roared in. Donovan sucked in a breath and kept on talking because it felt, for a moment, like talking was the only thing that would keep him sane. Some of the tape was so twisted it didn't even play right, but Mum would sing along. She knew all the words. She had a good voice too. I mean, not like a professional or anything, but she sang her heart out. I did too. I still know all the words to half that stuff. He could hear the music now, louder than bells inside his skull. He could hear his mum's voice, grainy and faint, like it was being played on that same old cassette tape. The hole in his life where she had been was suddenly vast and dark and cold, and he teetered on the edge of it. The only thing she didn't do was turkey, you know, for Christmas lunch. She hated it. You ever seen a real turkey? Man, they are ugly. Mum showed me a photo once and said there was no way on God's green earth she was going to put that wrinkled turd bird, that's what she called it, anywhere near her mouth. So Christmas Day we always had... He stopped, his breath hitching, the words reluctant to come out of hiding. We always had burgers. She made them herself. Like, not frozen or anything, but with actual mince and eggs. And we never had much money or anything since Dad left. Not that I ever knew him. There were never any presents. But it didn't matter because she poured her heart and soul into Christmas Day, into those burgers. I don't know how she made them so good, but they had everything on them. Pepper and cheese and bacon and pickles. Oh, Mama, we'd sit and watch crap TV, plates on our laps. Just the two of us, eating ourselves into a coma. Never wanted anything else. Never needed anything else. The whole canteen seemed to have fallen quiet. Adam and Batik stared across the table, neither of them moving, neither of them even daring to take a breath, as if frightened of scaring off a wild bird. Donovan didn't even know he was going to keep speaking until the words continued to fly from his mouth. Then it all changed. It all changed because of him. He was evil. You know, it wasn't even the fact he raised his fists to her. To me too, sometimes. She was tough. She could handle the bruises. That's not what killed her. It was all the other stuff. He hated her singing. Hated it. I mean, what kind of monster hates singing? But every time he heard her, he'd yell at her till she stopped. Every goddamn time. And then she stopped altogether. She just stopped singing. The anger seethed in him like boiling water. It felt as dangerous now as it had on that night. He hated Christmas too. That first Christmas he moved in with us, I was like 9 or something. He told Mum she couldn't have a tree, couldn't decorate, couldn't anything. The only thing he'd let her do was cook Christmas dinner for us, but he made her cook turkey, and nobody but him even touched it. He knew as well. That asshole knew what he was doing. Donovan ran a hand through his hair, sitting back on the bench. But she outwitted him, didn't she? See, Mum always knew how to look after me. She turned it into a game. When she put me to bed at night, we sang to each other, but we had to see who could sing the quietest. She'd lean right into me, and just like that, Donovan could feel her there, her cool cheek against his. The smell of her perfume, somehow inside his nose, even a mile beneath the ground. His next words were so quiet that the others had to crane forward to hear them. And she'd sung in a whisper. And she'd sing in a whisper. And I'd try to sing even quieter than her, and we'd both end up laughing. He blinked, and a fat tear rolled down his cheek. He scrubbed it away with fury, but there was an ocean of them there, a pressure inside his chest, his throat, his head, that felt powerful enough to blow the whole prison away. If he closed his eyes now, he knew he'd be right back there in his bed, just a kid again, him and Mum singing Silent Night in such hushed voices that it was as if the air itself was breathing the words. And every Christmas, he said, when Ryan fell asleep on his chair, she'd sneak into the kitchen. She'd cook us both burgers. And man, those ones, the ones we ate in secret in my bedroom, huddled on my bed, those ones were the best. I can't tell you how good they tasted. Because I had her back, you know. I had my mum back. He stopped talking, emptying his lungs with a shuddering sigh. It took him a moment to look up, and when he did, he could have sworn he saw Adam rubbing away a tear as well. His friend sat up, placing both palms gently on the table, as if to steady himself. "That's the most I've ever heard you speak," he said. "You okay?" Donovan nodded, clamping his trembling hands under his arms. He felt suddenly exhausted, more so than if he'd just finished a day in the chipping halls. Gradually, the sound of his mum's whispered voice faded, the smell of her faded, the taste of the burgers faded, and he was back inside Furnace, being eaten alive. "At least that arsehole's dead now," muttered Adam. "Got what was coming to him." Not really, thought Donovan. Ryan was free after all. It was Donovan who was paying the price. "That's why we've got to make this work," said Adam, jabbing the table with a finger. "That's why this is so important. You get it, don't you? This is the only way we survive, the only way we escape." "I get it," said Donovan. He looked at Adam, nodding. "So let's do this. Let's do this thing. Let's do it tomorrow." But tomorrow was no good. To the horror of every single inmate in the prison, the chipping halls were open for business again. Donovan was one of 50 prisoners marched into room 2 at gunpoint, just a flimsy helmet and a pickaxe to hold up the weight of the world. Enormous, fist-like chunks of rock had split loose from the ceiling, hard enough to punch their way into the ground. Orders were the same as always, to hack and clear, and for what had to have been 10 hours straight, Donovan did exactly that, certain that each swing of the pick would be his last. To his immense relief, he made it out alive. They'd cleared a good chunk of the cavern and propped it up as best they could, but it was clear it wasn't going to last. Sooner or later, the whole thing was going to come down, and next time, he knew, it wouldn't be so merciful. But what could they do about it? It wasn't like they had a union down here. The next morning, Donovan traipsed down the stairs to find Adam grinning at him. "You're in," he said. "Slop work. Don't mess this up." "Sure," Donovan said, stifling a yawn with his fist. "I got this." They ate their breakfast in nervous silence. There was a growing tension in the canteen, the air thick with the promise of violence. Whispers were circulating that an inmate had been shanked in his cell in the night, but nobody knew who it had been or what had happened to him. "Leopards and skulls," Adam said. "There's going to be a war at this rate. You watch yourself in there." Donovan followed the handful of inmates through the canteen door into the white-walled, low-ceilinged kitchens, rolling up his sleeves as he went. It was unbearably hot in here, the way it always was, the roaring burners sucking the oxygen out of the room. He grabbed one of the enormous cast-iron pots from the stove and hefted it to the sink, running the faucet and grabbing a wire brush. He looked around cautiously as he scrubbed, seeing 2 kids who had to be new fish and a couple of older boys who didn't seem to have any kind of allegiance painted on their clothes or skin. If it stayed like this, it would be a good day. He should have known not to tempt fate. Not here. He'd only just finished cleaning the first pot when the doors crashed open. The shape there, silhouetted by the light from the canteen, was so huge that at first Donovan thought it was a patrolling black suit. Then the figure took a few steps into the room, and Donovan recognised Ambrose Pope. By his side was another guy, much shorter and skinnier, but no less intimidating. Santiago, chief arsehole of the Leopards. Donovan swore beneath his breath, pretending to ignore the arrival. But when Ambrose called out his name, he dumped the pot back into the sink and turned to them. "Yeah," he said, trying to look surprised. "You want something?" Ambrose walked lazily across the room, picking up a scrap of something left on one of the metal counters and flicking it to the floor. Santiago followed, stooped over and as shifty as it was possible to be. The cigarette burns in his face were so deep that they looked like holes drilled right into the lightless pit of his skull. "Carl Eugene Donovan," said Ambrose, coming to a halt in front of him. He ran a hand through his scraggy beard, his eyes as cold and as dangerous as steel blades. He was no taller than Donovan, but there was something about him that made him look like a giant. Donovan forced himself to stay put, knowing that if he retreated now he'd never stop. He half wished he'd taken one of Adam's shanks, at least that way he'd have had more to defend himself with than a wooden spoon and some carrot peelings. "What's your game?" Santiago said to Donovan, sniffing hard and wiping the back of his hand over his nose. Ambrose held up a hand, and Santiago fell quiet. "What did I say, Santa? My rules." Ambrose glanced over his shoulder to make sure there was nobody watching. And there wasn't, because every other inmate had beetled to the shadows at the back of the room. Then he planted a big hand on Donovan's shoulder. "Heard some very interesting things, Carl," Ambrose went on. "Some very troubling things, which is strange because you never seemed like a troublemaker. You're OG, and you and the rest of the old boys stay out of our way. Only now, I hear different." "You hear wrong," Donovan said, the words out of his mouth before he could even work out why he was saying them. "Lie to me and I'll cut out your tongue," said Santiago, sliding a shiv from the pocket of his uniform. It looked like it had been carved from a shard of moon-yellow bone, the end filed wickedly sharp. "I'm not lying," Donovan said, keeping his voice as steady as he could. "No idea what you're talking about. Only a fool gets between the gangs." Ambrose laughed, and it wasn't a good sound. "Hear that, Santa?" he said. "Only a fool. Is that what you take us for?" "No," Donovan said. He felt an ache in his hand, realised he'd bunched it into a fist. "Never. You want to tell me what this is about?" "Oh, you know," said Santiago, picking at his dirty nails with the tip of the blade. "My boy Figgy tells me you was the one who started the fight in the halls. You stirred it all up." Oh, this is it, Donovan thought. Whatever came out of his mouth next would save him or kill him. "He's lying," Donovan said. "Figgy doesn't lie," said Santiago. "I'm not talking about Figgy," Donovan said, looking to Ambrose but pointing at Santiago. "I'm talking about him." "You what?" said the leader of the Leopards, his pocked face creasing with rage. "I don't know what this is," Donovan said, "but it's got nothing to do with me. I didn't see everything, but I saw Figgy speaking with those Niners. Then whatever it was got out of hand. Ask me, they're planning something, all of them, and he's using me as a distraction." Ambrose chewed his thoughts, his eyes growing dark. He looked at Santiago. "Something you're not telling me?" he growled. "They're lies," said Santiago. "What have I got to gain from a fight with the gangs?" Donovan said. "I don't want no part of it. The whole thing smells rotten." "It does," said Ambrose. "You better not be messing with me, Santa. You think the Leopards can take on the Skulls? You think you can sit on my throne?" "No," said Santiago, on the back foot now. "Of course not." "Even with the Niners on your side?" Donovan added. His heart was clattering against his ribs like a metal cup on bars. "He's working with them." "That what this is, Santa?" said Ambrose. "You blinded me to a coup?" "Could be a..." Donovan started, but Ambrose pointed a finger at him, throwing him a look as hard as a punch. "I don't know what's happening here, but I'm bored of it. Whatever it is you two want to sort out, you do it now. You hear?" Despite the heat, Donovan felt his blood cool and thicken. "Wait," he said. "We don't have to..." but permission had been granted. Santiago lunged without hesitation, the makeshift knife darting right for Donovan's throat. It was the wet floor that saved him, Donovan's foot slipping out from beneath him as he tried to move. He fell back, the knife shaving his neck as he crashed into the counter, then slid onto his ass. Santiago moved again, plunging the knife to the side, the blade slicing through the meat of Donovan's shoulder. There was no pain, just an awful wetness as blood escaped the wound, that and the roar of panic in his ears. Donovan fought to get up, pulling pots from the counter as he made it back to his feet. The sound of them hitting the stone floor was like an orchestra, and he prayed that it would be enough to draw the guards to the room. He'd been in fights before here, of course, but never with somebody like Santiago, and never with Ambrose Pope watching, a gleam in his eye. They both wanted blood, and it didn't matter whose it was. Santiago didn't talk. He edged closer, his shoulders tight, his free hand outstretched, and the one with the knife curled against his chest like a coiled snake. Donovan retreated, his head screaming, do something, you're going to die in here. His ass hit the sink, and he realised there was nowhere else to go. Santiago saw it too, his expression empty as he thrust the knife at Donovan's chest. Donovan twisted to the side, flailing in the sink for a weapon. The only thing he could find was the wire brush, and he tossed it at Santiago's face. The other boy didn't even respond. He just jabbed with the knife again. This time the bladed bone sank into the top of Donovan's chest. Only the tip, though, before Donovan curled his body back and drove a fist into Santiago's nose. Something in the other boy's face gave way, and Santiago unleashed a wet howl. Donovan grabbed the boy's knife and wrestled him, grabbed the boy's knife hand and wrestled him for it, only to feel a fist thump into his gut. Santiago was fast and blooded. He knew how to fight. His forehead smashed into Donovan's nose, and for a moment the kitchen went dark. Donovan reeled, knowing that any minute now the blade would sink into his throat or his gut. He staggered towards the stove, heaving in breaths and blinking until the world came back. Santiago was right there, his face a mask of rage as he stabbed the blade at Donovan's face. Donovan wheeled away, reaching out and grabbing the first thing he could find. The pot was hot, but he didn't let go, swinging it around in a tight arc. It was so heavy it almost slipped from his hand, but he held on, groaning with the agony of it. It hit Santiago in his outstretched wrist, and he screamed, dropping the knife. The weight of the pot dragged Donovan with it, and he almost lost his balance, his feet skittering on the rock floor as he hefted it up again. Santiago was down, scrabbling for the blade. He moved like a snake, snatching it up in a heartbeat and punching it into the side of Donovan's stomach. The world fizzed into heat and smoke, as if he had his face against one of the burners. Donovan tried to scream, but all that came out was a wet cry. He felt the strength drop out of him, but he was already swinging the pot around again, not to the side this time, but over his head, and gravity had taken over. The cast iron pot crunched into Santiago's head with a sound like a cathedral bell, and the boy dropped hard. Donovan swore, throwing the pot to the floor and putting his hand to his stomach. The blade had come free, but it had left a ragged hole, and the blood that dripped from it was as hot as boiling water. He collapsed against the sink, tearing at his overalls to try to get a better look at the wound. "Nice," said Ambrose, ducking down by Santiago. He put 2 fingers to the boy's neck, but there was no danger of him being dead. He was already groaning his way back from unconsciousness. Ambrose looked at Donovan. "Some muscle on you, son. Got a place with me if you ever want it." Donovan couldn't have replied if he'd wanted to. He was too busy clawing in desperate breaths. His overalls were already drenched, but he'd seen enough knife wounds to know that this one wasn't as bad as it looked. He grabbed a cloth from the side of the stove and clamped it to himself, gritting his teeth against the pain. "What have we done here?" he managed after a moment. Ambrose slapped Santiago's face hard, and again, and a third time, until the boy sat up. He looked like he'd been hit by a truck. He tried to glare at Donovan, but his bloodshot eyes rolled in their sockets. When he spoke, it was just mumbled gibberish. Come on, Santa, said Ambrose, grabbing Santiago's arm and hauling him up. Before the black suits get here, me and you need to talk. Somehow, Santiago managed to stand straight. Ambrose laughed as he kicked him hard in the rump, almost knocking him down again. He steered him through the doors, sending him on his way, and just as Donovan allowed himself to take a pain-laced breath, the bigger boy doubled back. He swaggered across the kitchen, adjusting his skull bandana. You know, he said, for the record, I believe you. Leopard's been working against us for weeks now, planning something stupid. But don't you worry about that. Worry about this. Ambrose walked right up to him, leaning in so close that Donovan could see the scraps of slop caught in his beard, the grease in his paws. I heard another tale about you, my friend. Want to know what it was? No, Donovan thought, but he didn't speak. I heard you planning something up there, you and Adam. I heard you took a pickaxe from the chipping room. Donovan shook his head. The agony radiating from the hole in his stomach was like a living thing, writhing beneath his skin. You calling me a liar? Ambrose asked. I'm not, said Donovan, more wheeze than words. Good, because I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to come and talk to you both very soon. I'm going to find out the truth. And if you're planning something, I want in. Donovan didn't reply. He just stared at the floor. But Ambrose hooked his fingers under Donovan's chin, the long yellow nails driving his head up until their eyes met. I want in, he said again. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, his laughter echoing around the room long after he'd gone. Donovan leant against the sink, because it was the only thing he felt capable of doing. His body was going into a post-adrenaline lockdown, his muscles like lead weights, his thoughts sluggish, his blood thick as it pounded through his ears. His stomach pulsed with a deep, dull agony, matched beat for beat by the wounds in his chest and shoulder. It felt almost as if there was a siren going off inside him. Boom, 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 but one made of pain rather than sound. He'd almost died. If he'd moved a little slower, that shank would have sunk all the way in and popped something inside him. He would have died right here on the kitchen floor. The thought of it was so big that it didn't fit inside his head. He couldn't quite comprehend it. It was only when he started to think about the fact that he could still die that his mind began to clear. Infection was rife down here in Furnace. Some of the kids deliberately covered their homemade knives in dirt and worse, so that a small cut could still kill. And if anyone was mean enough to do that, it was Santiago. Donovan ran the faucet, ripping at the hole in his overalls and peeling away the cloth until the wound was visible. Scraps of fabric had caught in it, but that was a good thing. It meant the blood was drying. He found a fresh cloth and rinsed it under the tap, then patted the wound. It wasn't as big as he'd feared, and it wasn't deep. There were no medical supplies here. If you wanted patched up, you went to the infirmary, but there was no coming back from there. That was gas mask territory. Donovan rooted beneath the sink until he found a bottle of bleach. He doused his cloth, jammed a wooden spoon between his teeth, and clamped the sodden fabric to the wound. The world fizzed white, a sudden high-pitched ringing in his ears. He fought the pain, holding the cloth there for as long as he could before ripping it away. A swear word roared up from inside him and he slammed a fist down on the metal surface. Some of the boys had begun to creep in from the back of the room, but they scattered like cockroaches, some even fleeing through the doors into the trough room. Donovan waited for his head to stop spinning before pressing the bleached cloth to the other two wounds, the pain of this lost beneath the throbbing agony in his stomach. Then, because nobody else would do it, he picked up the pan he'd hit Santiago with and started to cook. I just heard a knock on the door. I just want to make sure it's not my dad. Because we're technically in lockdown here, but we are delivering presents from the safety of the gardens. Hang on. Oh. It was. I missed him. Never mind. I will catch him up another time. Okay. And you probably will hear lots of screams below. Christmas-themed screams today from the children. But just imagine that they are the skulls and the niners and the leopards all basically fighting each other. Okay. It's really hot in here, but I don't want to take my hat off because it's so Christmassy. He wasn't sure how he managed to stay conscious for the whole shift. Fear helped. He'd expected Santiago back at any time, the rest of the leopards in his shadow. Donovan hadn't just beaten him, he'd embarrassed him, and there was nothing as dangerous down here as humiliation. But Ambrose was obviously keeping Santiago under control. The leopards might have thought they were tough, but it was the skulls who ruled the yard. Ambrose Pope was a prize fighter, as mean as they came, and Kevin was just a psychopath. There wasn't a soul in here who wasn't afraid of him, even Ambrose himself. Most of the tough kids ended up wearing a skull bandana because it was easier that way, safer. They were less likely to attack one of their own. If Donovan hadn't been an original, he probably would have been a skull by now too. Instead, he was a nobody. And if you were a nobody with a target on your back, then you were as good as dead. He might have just saved himself, though. If Ambrose believed that Santiago was making a play for power, then he'd go after the leopards with a vengeance. According to Adam, he'd been looking for an excuse to do exactly that for a long time. Donovan hefted the last empty slop pot back from the trough room, slamming it into the sink. He was exhausted, but the exhaustion numbed the pain. He filled the pot with water from the faucet, then turned to one of the other kids. "Oh, I'm done," he growled. "You finish it." The kid started to groan. Then he saw Donovan's expression and snatched up a brush. Donovan left him to it, staggering to the metal shelf by the sink. It hurt to bend down, but he collected the parcel he'd stashed there earlier. He'd had to dive through about 15 stinking cartons of old food from the surface, his rubber gloves caked in rotting meat and slimy vegetable matter before he'd found what he was looking for. But he had found it. Wincing, he tucked the parcel into his overalls, clamping his hand to his stomach as he made his way out of the kitchen. Groups of inmates loitered in every corner, looking at his bloodied clothes the way sharks look at a wounded fish, and he did his best to walk straight and tall. By the time he'd climbed the stairs to his cell, though, he felt ready to drop straight into a coma. "Jesus, Carl! What happened to you?" Adam leapt gracefully from his bunk, running to Donovan's side and taking his arm. "Are you okay? You look like you've been in a fight with a bulldozer." "Worse," Donovan said, managing the ghost of a smile. "Santiago." "No way," Adam said, steering Donovan to the bottom bunk and helping him climb in. The pain flared as he tried to get comfortable, but then it began to ebb away. Adam propped a pillow beneath his head, then used a finger to open the tear in his uniform. "Did he shank you?" "3 times, said Donovan. "And you're still breathing?" "I got lucky," Donovan said. "I knocked him out with a pot." Adam nodded, his expression dark. "He's going to finish what he started," he said. "I took him once, didn't I?" Donovan shifted his position, groaning. "Ambrose was there too. He'll keep him off my back for a while. There's a serious storm brewing between those two." "First you bring down the chipping room," Adam said. "Then you start a gang war. If I'd known this plan was going to be so hardcore, I'd never have agreed to it." "Yes, you would," said Donovan, breathing a quiet laugh through his nose. "Yeah, I would," said Adam. "Speaking of which..." "I got them," Donovan said. "Best I could, anyway." Adam punched him gently in the shoulder, and Donovan yelped. "You are my man," Adam said. "I can't believe you did it." "Can't believe I got stabbed for it," Donovan said, pulling the package from his overalls and handing it to Adam. "This better work. After all this, it better work." "It will," Adam said. "Tomorrow. It will work. You can bet your life on it." "I already have," Donovan thought. "I already have." They lay on the bottom bunk together, side by side, and watched the prison as it rode into the evening. Donovan's mind teetered on the edge of unconsciousness, occasionally tumbling into the dark before a sunburst of pain dragged it back. Every time it did, he jumped, making the whole bed shake. And every time it did, Adam asked the same thing. "You okay?" After the 4th or 5th time, Donovan laughed. "What?" Adam said, looking at him. The bed was so narrow, and they were both so big, that they were pressed against each other. There was barely room between his friend and the wall for Donovan to breathe. But he didn't mind. There was something reassuring about being crushed into the corner. It made him feel safe, feel hidden. They'd had a cat once, him and his mum. Just a stray. Poor thing had looked like it had spent its life right here in Furnace. Its fur all but dropped out, its skin red raw and crisscrossed with scars. They'd fed it, let it in, but it had been on its last legs, and they'd both been waiting for it to drop. Then, for a reason Donovan had never discovered, his mum had given the cat a box. The tiniest little cardboard carton you could imagine, barely big enough for the scrawny little rat bag. That was the name they'd given it, he remembered. Rat bag. To crawl inside. But it had crawled inside, compacting itself in there like a contortionist, just coming out to eat and drink and poop. That box had purred like a charger for 23 hours a day for the next 3 years. He just wants the world to be a little smaller, his mum had said. Donovan felt like that right now. He felt like that every time Adam was next to him. You ask me that a lot, Donovan said. You ask me if I'm okay. I do not, Adam replied, scoffing. You wish I did. Don't know why I bother, though. You always say the same thing. Yeah? Yeah, that's what you say. Yeah. Yeah. Donovan could feel Adam's laughter. Outside, somebody ran full pelt down the platform, but if they were running from something, it never appeared. So, said Adam, you're okay? Yeah, said Donovan. He shook his head. Actually, no. Today was the closest I've come. I nearly didn't make it out of there. Scary, right? Said Adam. One time, before I even got to Furnace, back in juvie, someone punched a shank into my back. Went deep, so deep they sent me to the hospital. You remember those days? You remember when they cared enough about us they'd actually throw us in an ambulance and drive us to hospital? He shook his head. Came this close to puncturing my lung, but I got caught in a rib. It was a pen, you believe that? Stabbed by a goddamn bick. Santiago had a bone, Donovan said, and Adam shuddered. Gross. But yeah, I remember that feeling. I remember I was sinking, like I was sinking into a grave or something. I can't describe it, sinking into something dark and cold, and I was so angry. Scared, yeah, but angry. Angry at my dad for messing things up for me, at myself for doing so much stupid stuff. I swore right there that after I'd done my time, I'd try to make things better. Try to make me better. I promised myself. He sighed, scratching at the bottom of the bunk overhead. Never had the chance, though. 4 more years and I'd have been out. I'd have been free. Then they opened this place and 4 years became forever. Donovan took a painful breath. It's not right, said Adam, his anger pulsing out of him in waves. You believe in God? I don't. Not anymore. I think this is it. We get one shot and when we die, that's it. It's not right that our one shot is down here. This is all we're ever going to get. Donovan felt like he was sliding into something cold and dark and forever right now. The enormity of what Adam was saying was too much. It was like a black hole had opened up inside his skull and was chewing the world to pieces. He tried to sit up and found that he couldn't. So he breathed instead, slow and deep. He just breathed. I was going to be a lawyer, said Adam. You believe that? I thought you were going to make yourself a better person, Donovan said. Adam thumped him in the leg. What about you? Where would you have ended up? Donovan had asked himself that question so many times he could have answered in his sleep. My mum was a teacher, he said. High school English? She was good at it too. I think I'd have followed her. Your ambition is inspiring, said Adam, with no small amount of sarcasm. Teacher, wish I'd aimed that high. This time it was Donovan who thumped Adam in the leg, and both of them grimaced with pain. I was aiming high, he said. I was aiming for her. With a bone-crunching snap, the lights cut out, the prison going dark so violently that Donovan's stomach lurched with the shock of it. He lay there, Adam next to him, both of them breathing in that darkness as the symphony of the prison began. The cries, the screams, the shouts, the threats, the laughter, and those mournful songs that rose up from level to level, as if searching for freedom. This is what it will be like, he thought. This is what death is like inside Furnace, because you don't escape this place. Not ever. Not even when you're dead. The feeling of dread that entered him was so overpowering. It was monstrous, and he pushed closer to Adam just so his world felt a little smaller. You okay? Adam asked. Yeah, he said. Yeah. A howl unleashed itself in the dark, one of the warden's dogs on the loose. Donovan wondered if tonight would see a blood watch, if he'd waken the crimson dark to a gas mask outside his cell, its filthy needle at the ready. If anything, the night seemed to grow even darker. You ever ask yourself what's keeping us here? He asked. Sort of stupid question is that? Adam said. Guards, guns, bars, and about 1 billion tons of rock. I mean, why doesn't everyone end it all the moment they walk through the doors? It's the only thing we can do. Curl up and cower and wait for death, right? Got no hope of it ever changing, no hope at all. We've got nothing down here. He could hear Adam chewing over the question. You've not got nothing, Carl. You've got me, he said. And Donovan laughed gently. No, seriously, Adam went on. The worst thing this place does is empty you. Right up there at the Black Fort, Furnace picks you up and turns you upside down, and it just shakes and shakes and shakes until every little piece of you falls out. You come down here an empty thing. Got no mind left, no hope, got no heart. You leave it all up there. And sometimes that's a good thing, because if you've got no mind, then it can't be twisted. If you've got no heart, it can't be broken. But you've got to remember, Carl, that none of this is real. None of that is real. You do have a mind. You do have a heart. You know the best thing you can do to stay alive down here? And I don't mean just alive, I mean alive. You know the very best thing you can do? Donovan shook his head. He felt a hand rest gently on his chest, only for a moment. The best thing you can do is bring your heart down here with you. You keep it down here with you. Whatever happens, however bad it gets, you keep it. Then his hand was gone, and Donovan felt for a moment as if a weight had lifted from him, as if he might just float up through the dark into the golden day. Thanks, Yoda, he said, exhaustion crowding the corners of his head. He heaved in a long, painful breath. Now get your fat ass out of my bed. I need some sleep. We're almost there. Adam spoke quietly through a mouthful of slop, leaning over the table so that the others could hear him. The trough room was full, but the atmosphere was still muted. The ceiling felt lower than ever, the raw red walls patiently digesting them. It had been nearly a month since the last blood watch, and people were getting scared. It was like one of those signs that said 30 days since the last tornado, Donovan thought. The longer you went without one, the more likely it was to happen, and the worse it would be when it arrived. Just ride out the day, then we can do this, Adam went on. Just ride out the day. Batik appeared, slamming his tray onto the table and sitting down on the bench next to Adam. Did you get them? Adam asked. Hi, Batik, Batik replied in a pretty good impression of Adam's gruff voice. How are you doing today? How did you sleep? How's your general mood and well-being on this fine morning? Oh, shut up, Adam said through a smile. Yes or no? I got it, he said. Was hard, though. Black suits everywhere in the laundry yesterday. It's in my bunk. I'll grab it after hard labour. Adam nodded, shoveling the last of his water and speaking as he chewed. You know what to do then. Our cell, as soon as you're free. Don't mess it up and don't say a thing to anyone, okay? Donovan nodded, trying to ignore the suspicious lumps in his breakfast. His stomach churned, not just because of the wound, which was healing up with no sign of infection, but because today was the day. They'd been planning this for so long, and so much was riding on it. One wrong move, one careless word, and they wouldn't just fail. They'd die. The volume in the room dipped, and Donovan looked up to see the leopards walk in. Santiago's face was more bruised than flesh, but his expression was as clear and as dangerous as ever. He found Donovan instantly, eyeballing him as he crossed the room. Incoming, Donovan said, and the others turned to see. But Santiago veered off, heading for the counter where the food was being served. Donovan got to his feet. I'm out of here. I'll catch you later. Stay alive, Adam said. Great advice. Thank you, Donovan replied, keeping his head down as he walked out of the canteen. He flew into the yard so fast he slammed right into somebody else, his heart sinking when he realised it was Ambrose. "Whoa, son," said the skull, grabbing Donovan's arm in an iron grip. "You look like you're running from the devil." Kevin stood there too, his face so slack that he could have been wearing a Halloween mask. He hawked up something big and wet, then spat it at Donovan's feet. Donovan shook himself free of Ambrose's grip, staring the bigger kid in the eye. "You're up to something," Ambrose said. "I can feel it. You know a way out." "No," said Donovan. "You know something," he said. A black suit passed by, shotgun resting on his shoulder. He glared at Ambrose with his silver eyes, and Ambrose smiled at him until he moved on. He turned back to Donovan, patting him on the shoulder. "I'll see you later, Carl," he said. "Remember, whatever it is, I'm in." He walked off, Kevin trailing behind him like a shadow. Donovan limped across the yard, joining the crowds that were loitering outside the chipping halls. It was the last place he wanted to be, but at least there was less chance of Santiago attacking him here. And if he did, Donovan would have a pickaxe to defend himself with. He might need it too, he thought, as Santiago and Figgy and almost all the other leopards joined the melee. To his relief, the black suit sent him and the rest of his level to the first chipping room. There was a round of panicked protests as 50 or so kids were herded into the second, the leopards included. Donovan slung on a hard hat and selected a pickaxe, traipsing through the low-ceiling tunnel into the cavernous space. Ambrose was here too, he saw, and a handful of skulls, all of whom loitered by the entrance. Donovan moved as far away from them as he could, heading for the back of the room and starting work. Every time he swung the pickaxe, he felt like the wound in his stomach was opening again, and he took it as easy as he dared. His mind wasn't exactly on the job. It was on tonight. It was on the plan. Just ride out the day. He sensed the change in the air, some instinct that prison life had given him, a punch of adrenaline that seemed to come from nowhere. He turned, the pickaxe held defensively. The skulls were on the move. Their swift, hushed movements what drew his attention. They weren't heading this way, though. They were heading back out through the tunnel into the equipment room. Donovan watched them go. There wasn't a black suit in sight, but he knew they patrolled the tunnels and the rooms constantly. Leaving your post would mean a few days in the hole. Leaving your post with a weapon would mean a whole lot worse. Come on, Donovan, just ride out the day. He lifted the pick, attacking the wall. If anyone else had noticed the skulls leaving, they didn't show it. The inmates were on form today, the engine of their pickaxes pulling chunks from the rock face. It was deafening, like it always was. But past it, Donovan heard something else. Something wrong. He heard screams. Just ride out the day, he told himself, but the screams were growing louder, and they were coming from outside the cavern. Donovan's pulse ramped up a gear. There was no point being in here if something bad went down. There was no way out. Gripping the pickaxe, he moved quickly across the room. Other people had noticed the screams, and a handful ran after him. They barely crossed half the room before a peal of thunder crunched through the rock overhead. It was so loud that Donovan dropped the pickaxe to clamp both hands to his ears. Not that it did any good. The sound seemed to pour through him, shaking his bones to dust. A cave-in. He wasn't sure if he said it or if he just thought it. He put his head down and bolted, the rock floor cutting through his paper shoes, inmates thumping into him as they too ran for their lives. He shoved somebody out of his way and ran into the equipment room in time to see Ambrose and his skulls running out of room 2, all of them still holding their pickaxes. It was dark in here, but Donovan didn't miss the dull gleam of blood on the blades. "Better run," Ambrose said as another crack detonated overhead. Donovan didn't need to be told twice. He dropped the axe and sprinted after Ambrose, looking back only once as a river of dust and rock exploded from the entrance to room 2. Then he was in the yard, prisoners punching and kicking their way past him as they all ran for safety. Black suits piled through the vault door, more running down from the platforms. "Thanks," said a voice behind Donovan, and he turned to see Ambrose there. Specks of blood decorated his face, and he smeared them away with the back of his hand. Kevin sauntered over, wearing the sickest grin Donovan had ever seen. "Thanks for what?" Donovan asked, his voice shaking. "For the idea," Ambrose said. "Santiago's out the picture, him and his gang. No more leopards. And for that, I owe you." "No," Donovan said, shaking his head. How many kids had been in there? How many had died? No, this isn't on me." "Always a place for you here," Ambrose said again, offering Donovan his red right hand. Kevin glared at it like he wanted to slice it off, but he didn't speak. "I told you no," Donovan said. Ambrose shrugged. "Suit yourself, son." He turned and walked away just as the lockdown siren howled into the yard. Donovan's entire body was carved from pain. He wasn't sure if he could take another step. Then he heard them, over the siren, the echo of falling rock and the ghost-like screams of the dead, chasing him all the way back to his cell. Let's have a sip of tea. That's so cold. "It wasn't you," Adam said from his bunk. "Whatever you're thinking, don't." Donovan stared through the bars at the yard below. All around him, the inmates of Furnace did the same, their faces drowned in the shadows of their cells, their eyes wide and bright, almost like stars, he thought. 2 black suits were carrying a huge wooden plank through the entrance to the chipping rooms. "They're sealing it off," he said. "Oh, thank God," Adam replied, the bed creaking beneath his weight as he shifted his position. "At least we won't have to go in there anymore." "And the others?" Donovan said. "There must have been 50 of them." "Peace now, I guess," said Adam. "He's just going to leave them there," Donovan said. Adam didn't reply, because they both knew the truth was a lot worse. The truth was a pack of hungry hounds and a feast beneath the rock. "No more leopards, at least," said Adam. "I won't miss them. Got to focus on the good, Carl. Don't do to dwell on death." Donovan pressed his forehead to the cool bar. How could he not dwell on death when those were his dead? Not just them, but Ryan too. And his mum. "Don't," said Adam, reading his mind. "You'll drive yourself crazy." Too late, thought Donovan. "Come here," said Adam. "Soon as this is over, we can get on with it. We can do this thing." "But why?" Donovan asked. "Because we have to," Adam said. "We have to try." Donovan was about to reply when he felt the judder of metal against his face. He pulled his head back as the deafening blast of the siren filled the prison and the cell doors rattled open. Donovan walked tentatively onto the platform, Adam appearing beside him. Like frightened rabbits, every single inmate left his cell and stood there, watching the figure who strolled from the vault door. Warden Cross made his way to the very centre of the yard. The prison, so silent that Donovan could hear the crunch of gravel beneath his perfectly polished shoes. His suit was immaculately tailored over his skeletal form, but his face didn't fit so well. The leathery skin seemed too loose somehow, like it might just peel away and flop to the floor. Donovan almost made the mistake of studying the man's eyes, looking away at the last minute. Those eyes were something else. They were like standing on the lip of the Grand Canyon and feeling a hand shove you in the small of your back. As you will know by now, the warden said, his voice quiet, but somehow reaching every level of the prison. "We experienced a cave-in today. As far as we can tell, 33 souls perished." Donovan's veins iced up and he shuddered, holding onto the railing for support. Adam placed a hand on top of his, squeezing gently. "It matters not. Like the rest of you, those inmates died the moment they set foot inside Furnace Penitentiary. Death is a fair punishment for their crimes. But we have reason to believe the cave-in was not an accident, and for that there will be retribution." His head swept from side to side, those eyes like negative searchlights spreading darkness. "All of those responsible will be found, and they will be punished. Until then, room 2 is out of bounds. And the canteen is closed for 24 hours. A swell of quiet protest rippled around the prison, silenced by a look from the warden. "This is my house, and I am God here. I can be the devil too, if you like." He gave them all one last stare, a stare that Donovan could feel sliding into his head like a needle. Then he turned sharply on his heels and walked back through the vault door. His guards spread out across the yard, their shotguns glinting in the harsh light. "Arsehole," muttered Adam, pulling his hand away. He sighed, looking at Donovan. "Maybe this isn't the best time to do this. Maybe we should leave it. Bad time to make a noise in here. Bad time to try anything. Best be quiet. Best..." "No," said Donovan. "Spent too much of my life being quiet. If Cross wants me, he can come get me. But he's not taking this away from us." He turned to Adam, managing a smile. "We do this," he said. "We do it now." He thought of escape 1,000,000 times, of course. It was all anyone thought about when they first arrived. But he'd never thought about doing it like this. They worked in silence, he and Adam kneeling by the bunk and using the mattress as a workbench. Their excitement was feverish, each of them glancing at the cell door every few seconds to make sure they were alone. Donovan sawed at the pick handle with one of Adam's shanks. It was hard work because the wood was tough, but gradually the groove got larger until, with a pistol shot, he managed to break a 6-inch section free from the rest. He did it again, sweating more than he did in the chipping room. "You know what you're doing?" Adam asked. "Don't mess it up." "No, I got this," said Donovan. He began to drill out a hole in one of the smaller sections, twisting the shank and blowing away the wood peelings. It took forever, but eventually it was a big enough socket for him to slot the bigger piece of wood into, so that it looked like an upside-down T. He was in the process of doing the same thing to the other small piece when he heard footsteps, coming fast. Somebody flew into the cell, and Donovan reeled back. Adam shot up so quickly he cracked his head on the top bunk, cursing at the top of his voice. "Batik," Adam said, his eyes watering. "What the hell, man? You almost killed me." Batik laughed, holding out a cloth parcel. "Serves you right for starting without me," he said. Donovan took the parcel, opening it to see that it was stuffed with thin scraps of grey linen. "Best I could do," said Batik. "Nothing in here is clean anymore." It'll do," Donovan said, emptying the rags onto the bed. "You nearly done," Batik said. "Done a lot quicker if you shut your mouth and help," Adam said. Batik did, taking over the woodwork while Donovan rooted around beneath his sheet for the package he'd stolen from the kitchen. It was starting to smell a little, but when he opened it up it still looked green enough. He emptied the parcel next to the linen strips. "Is that it?" said Batik. "Salad bar was closed," Donovan replied, hissing a laugh through his nose. "Ready?" Batik nodded. He'd fixed the pickaxe shaft loosely to the other two smaller sections, binding them with linen, and when he placed it in the middle of the uneven floor, it stood upright. It was only 2 foot tall, but it looked steady enough. "Okay, let's do this," Donovan said. He reached for the first bit of greenery, what might have been a Brussels sprout stalk, and used a tangle of cloth to tie it to the pickaxe handle. It took a bit of doing, but eventually it stuck out at an angle, like a limp arm. There were a couple of sticks of celery, and he tied them on too, then a few heads of mouldering broccoli. He peeled open a leek, his eyes watering as he layered the damp strips around the rest of the vegetables. All that was left was some browning salad leaves, but when he draped them over the rest, they actually looked pretty convincing. "Goddamned Michelangelo," said Adam, laughing. "Yeah, well, let's see what you can do," Donovan said. Outside, from the yard, a shotgun blast echoed up the walls. The prison was unusually quiet, beaten into silence by the warden's words. Any minute now, Donovan knew, a black suit could walk past, then open the cell door and discover what they were doing. He might take them to the hole, he might just open fire and deal with the mess later. What were 3 more dead inmates after today? "Come on," he urged Adam. Adam dug the rest of the shanks out from beneath his bed, tying more strips of linen around the handles. He passed them to Donovan, who set about trying to secure them to the celery and broccoli and stalks. Adam tied the last one on himself. "And these?" Batik asked, holding up the remaining pieces of cloth. Donovan took them, draping them around the vegetables as best he could. Then they stood back and admired their work. "It doesn't really look like a tree," said Adam, his voice edged with disappointment. But Donovan was grinning. "Does to me," he said. And it did. It really did. The little Christmas tree stood there, its greenery bright against the dull rock, its ornaments swinging to and fro, the blades sparkling as they caught the light. The linen strips didn't exactly look like tinsel, but they didn't not look like tinsel either, especially if you squinted. "You got to be kidding me." The voice from the door cut him off. All three boys whipped around to see Ambrose there, a dark, dangerous frown on his face as he looked inside. Kevin was by his side, sneering, a cruel metal shank in his hand. "What's this?" said Ambrose, ducking under the gate and entering the cell. He seemed to push all the air out before him, and Donovan grasped for oxygen, finding none. He tried to stand in front of the tree, but Ambrose grabbed his arm and pulled him out of the way, staring down at it. "Not worth it, Pope," said Adam, bristling, fists by his side. "None of your concern." "This is it," growled the skull. "This is what you were planning." He looked at Donovan in disbelief, and Donovan nodded. "But why?" he asked. "Why risk it?" "Because it's all we've got," Donovan said. "Because it's Christmas." "Hell it is," said Kevin, stepping past Ambrose, but Ambrose held out a big hand, rooting his lieutenant in place. "It's Christmas?" Ambrose asked, his voice quiet. Donovan shrugged again. "Who knows?" he said. "But it could be. It is for us." "Come on, Ambrose," said Kevin. "They're taking the..." Ambrose glared at Kevin, jabbing a finger at his face. Kevin held his eye, but only for a moment. Shaking his head and sliding the shank back into his overalls, he skulked from the cell. Ambrose looked down at the little tree, and for a moment, for the briefest of seconds, his expression softened. "Christmas," he said. "Who'd have thought?" He turned and walked from the cell, stopping by the door. Then he looked back, pulling the skull bandana from his head. He studied it for a moment before handing it to Donovan. "It's not a star, not an angel either," he said. "But hell, where are you going to find an angel in Furnace Penitentiary?" A sad smile appeared on his face as he looked once more at the tree. "I'm going to need it back in the morning," he said. "Merry Christmas, Carl Donovan." Then he was gone. For a moment afterwards, nobody spoke. Donovan couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Ambrose Pope was the old lion of Furnace. He'd weathered 100 fights and sent just as many people to the infirmary. Donovan had never seen him beaten, not even close. Not until today, not until he'd seen their tree. Their beautiful little tree. Donovan burst into laughter at the stupidity of it, surprised to find that there were tears in his eyes too. He scrubbed them away before anyone could see, but they saw. Adam walked over and slung a heavy arm around Donovan's shoulders, pulling him close. "Some tree," he said. "It's perfect," Donovan replied. And it was perfect, because for a moment he could smell the pine. He could feel the gentle scratch of it on his arm as he reached for his presents. He could hear the rattle of baubles and his mum's laughter ringing out behind him as she watched him tear through the paper. He could smell the sizzling beef as she cooked up burgers. And he could feel her arms around him, always so tight. He closed his eyes, and she was right there, her eyes bright, her smile the biggest thing in the world. For that moment, for that wonderful, timeless moment, he could fly. "Thank you," he said, to his mum, to Adam. He couldn't hold them back anymore, the tears, but he didn't need to. Not here. He let them flow, burning down his cheeks like boiling water. He let Adam hold him, and he looked at that tree and wondered how something so small could mean so much. "Thank you, kiddo," Adam said through tears of his own. "You know something?" Donovan shook his head. "If we can do this, we can do anything." Donovan nodded, and before he even knew he was doing it, he opened his mouth and began to sing. Silent Night, of all things. It started as nothing more than a breath, as if he was back home, huddled in the corner of his room with his mum, singing in whispers so as not to wake Ryan. How many times had he spoken in whispers here too, frightened into silence by the black suits, by the warden, by the gangs and the gas masks and the dogs. That was another thing Furnace took from you, your voice. But not today. He straightened, sucked in a breath, and sang. The song bubbled up from deep inside him like a swimmer rising for air. He couldn't have stopped it even if Cross himself had entered the cell and planted a gloved hand over his mouth. Adam joined in, his voice surprisingly high. Batik too, even though he didn't know the words. The three of them stood around that little tree and sang their hearts out. Someone appeared in the cell door. Just a kid, his eyes full of wonder. When he saw the tree, a smile appeared on his face, and he picked up the song, his voice wavering, uncertain. So did the next kid, even though he was older and had stripes painted beneath his eyes. Within the first few lines, there were so many boys there that Donovan couldn't see the yard, all of them grinning, all of them singing, or humming at least if they didn't know the words. It swelled like a wave, passing from cell to cell, level to level, a dozen voices, 2 dozen, then hundreds, the sound of it deafening. It seemed to break Donovan's heart and mend it again, all in one go. He looked at Adam, both of them sobbing. "You okay?" Adam asked. "Yeah," he said. And this time, he meant it. They went on all night, or at least it seemed that way. The whole prison sang, even when the black suits ordered them to stop, even when the siren blasted its way into the yard in an effort to drown them out, even when the lights snapped off. They sang, and they sang, and for that one night at least, the prison didn't seem quite so deep or quite so dark. All because of that little tree. But if something so small as a broken prop could bring down a ceiling, then maybe a little thing like this was all it took to bring down a prison. It was that skirmish between the skulls and the leopards, after all, that opened up a crack in the floor of room 2. And Donovan couldn't know, he would never know, that it was because of the cave-in and all those deaths that Warden Cross sent out his black suits to find fresh meat, even if it meant framing them. "Merry Christmas," Donovan said to Adam in the dark, as the prison rang with sound. "And to you, Carl," Adam said. "Merry Christmas, my friend." Donovan knew it couldn't last, of course. He knew that tomorrow he and Adam would pull that little tree apart and hide the pieces around the prison. What he didn't know was that just 2 short weeks later, Adam would be ripped from his cell by the Bloodwatch, his fingernails gouging tracks into the wall as he screamed Donovan's name. He didn't know that the night after that, Kevin would kill Ambrose in his sleep and take control of the skulls, murdering Batik along with 3 other boys the following day, just because he could. It took another 2 months almost before the elevator doors opened and a young inmate called Alex Sawyer stepped out into the yard. And the rest, well, that's history. But that night, there was music. I'm going to try not to cry. But that night, there was music. There was light. There was joy. And a mile beneath the ground, beneath heaven and beneath hell, for a group of bright young men, there was Christmas. Sorry, I'm terrible at this. Oh, well, there you go. Hopefully a happy story. I hope you enjoyed that. And I hope that however you celebrate, you have a wonderful holiday and that next year is a much better year for everyone in every way. And there's only one thing left for me to say is I love you all and Merry Christmas. Thanks for listening.